Without further ado, this is Rout and Slaughter Ensued, the archaeology of the Battle of Camden and the Camden Burial Project. I'll give you Jim Legg. Indeed. Okay, how is my volume? Will this do? No? All right. How's my volume then? Good. Okay. Just give me that sign if I'm not loud enough, because I don't project very well. Okay, what I have today is a summary of the Camden Battlefield Archaeological Project, with an emphasis on the burial project that we did last year. I don't intend this to be a history of the battle, which of course is readily accessible, but I think we need a little bit of context. So let me give a very brief summary of the battle itself. Camden was one of the largest battles fought in the South during the Revolution, and it was one of the worst disasters suffered by the American cause in the entire war. And it was actually, Camden was the second time in 4 months that the primary American army in the South was completely destroyed. The first time, of course, was in the fall of Charleston in May. Okay. I was trying page down. You're trying to advance it? Ah, there we go. I have to hit it twice. Okay, all right. Okay, so a brief summary. The battle was fought in an old-growth longleaf pine forest about 8 miles north of the town of Camden. At that time, Camden was already a significant British outpost in the interior. It was a logistical base and an operational base in order to hold this part of the Carolinas. Now, on the night of August 15th, 1780, the American army was headed south toward Camden. The British army was headed north out of Camden to intercept that army. Neither army had any idea about the immediate presence of the other army. So they collided, essentially accidentally, in the middle of the night on the road about 8 miles out of town. Actually, let me get back to now, there was a confused skirmish in the middle of the night, but then both sides drew off and lined up for a formal engagement the following morning. Now, this map is probably the best shot we'll ever have at actually placing the units on the current ground. This is derived from 14 or 15 primary accounts of the battle, which is just about all that's known, and the archaeological evidence that we've amassed since 1998. And the ground surface is a real LiDAR image surface. And I don't see how we could refine this any further. So the future interpretation on the battlefield will have the units in these locations at the beginning of the battle. The American locations are very solid. The British locations are a little more approximate, but this is as real as we can get. The American Army under Horatio Gates is in blue, and they numbered about 3,500, but more than half of that total was North Carolina and Virginia militia, who, as we will see, ended up being worse than useless. The light blue is the militia. The dark blue are Continental units. Incidentally, the road on this map is the road. Current Flat Rock Road, Highway 58, is the original wagon road to the north. They're all in almost exactly the same place. So everything fits really well in that sense. The topography is still essentially the same, with the road running up to the north through the middle of this relatively flat plateau. So that much of it works really well in terms of interpreting the battle from the primary sources on the ground. Lord Cornwallis, the British commander in red there, his troops numbered only about 2,200, but they were almost entirely British regulars and British provincials who were semi-professional American troops. So he had a better quality overall, even though he had smaller numbers to begin with. Okay, to make a long story short, the British attacked. Nearly all of the American militia immediately ran away, and it left the Continentals outnumbered and ultimately outflanked. After a really desperate struggle that supposedly lasted about 45 minutes, the Continentals were overwhelmed and driven from the field with very heavy casualties. Now, we don't have really accurate figures for the American casualties, but we've pretty much agreed that they were probably with the British. There were between 350 and 400 dead left on the field on the morning of August 16th, and probably twice that many wounded. Now, that's an approximation, but it's an extrapolation from the numbers of the missing, the known strength beforehand, and so forth. So it's a pretty good guess. I don't think it was much more than 400. Cornwallis suggests that he killed upwards of 1,000 Americans, which is ridiculous. That he didn't have any grounds for saying, but his official report suggests. Okay, this is my co-investigator in this project, Steve Smith, who is a research archaeologist at the Institute. Steve is standing next to the monument to Baron Johann de Kalb, who was the American second in command in the Battle of Camden. He was mortally wounded and captured that day. Now, when I became interested in the battle in about 1980, and I first went to the battlefield, I expected to be able to tour the battlefield and understand what had happened there and whatever. This is all that was there, minus Steve. That monument was it. There was no indication of where on the battlefield the monument was relative to where the battle was fought. There was no interpretation of any kind. And the degree of preservation on the site was, there was a 6-acre tract preserved by the DAR around the de Kalb monument. And that was it. Everything else was paper company pine stands. So I was a little disappointed in my visit to the battlefield because there was really nothing to understand there. Let's jump forward to 1996. I received a call from my good friend Chris Judge. Chris said that Lindsay Pettis was looking for someone who claimed to understand the Battle of Camden, because he was planning or negotiating with the Bowater Paper Company to do a conservation easement on the core of the battlefield. At that time, I think we were looking at 200 acres. Later, the figure was 400 acres. In any case, Lindsay and I crossed paths. We visited the battlefield. Later, Chris and Lindsay and I and a couple of other people laid out this easement, which ended up being 392 acres. Now, some of this was a guesstimate on my part, just based on an understanding of the primary sources, but I couldn't have done any better. So I'm not claiming that I knew the battlefield that well, but I had to pick something based on what I knew, and it turned out to be a really good 392 acres. Now, we now have upwards of 800 acres actually preserved. The easement instrument is still embedded in the deeds, but the property in the easement plus all this other acreage is now owned outright by either Historic Camden or by the South Carolina Battleground Trust. So we have about 800 acres, and we'd like to get 200 or 300 more, but the entire core of the battlefield where the serious combat took place is preserved. So at this stage, the availability of the battlefield was such that I was thinking it would be really great to do some archaeology there sooner or later. I was already at the Institute, had been for some years. We didn't have money to do a project like that, but it was something that I spoke with Steve Smith about early on. So that ultimately we need to do the Camden battlefield in some sense, because it's being preserved. In 1998, we were surprised to see that the Bowater Paper Company had clear cut almost the entire easement and half of the rest of the battlefield, mostly on the west side of Highway 58. And this is what it looked like. You can see probably half of what they cut in this one photograph. When this was done, I got with the Bowater people and said, is it okay if we go out and do a sample project to try to assess the potential, the archaeological potential for the battlefield? Now, I knew that the place had been really heavily relic hunted for decades. And I already knew some of the collectors who had been out there. I'd seen some collections. And I already knew that most Civil War battlefields, for example, have so little material remaining after metal detecting that a coherent picture of the events was difficult to put together. But I wanted to see what was still there. So we did, over a period of a couple of weekends, myself and 3 volunteers did this very small metal detecting project on part of this clear cut on the west side of the road. And we found 47 battle artifacts and a lot of junk from an early 20th century house site that was in the same area that I chose. In any case, 47 artifacts was not impressive, but extrapolating that to the entire battlefield, I thought it would show us at least where the battle was fought, in a real sense. So that's what's going on here. Now, beginning in about 2000, I forget if it's 2000 or 2001, the preservation process had moved to Palmetto Conservation Foundation. And they began receiving grant money that they shared with us on 3 separate occasions between 2001 and 2008. And that's when we were able to actually begin this project. In fact, this is the only portion of the project that was ever paid for until last year. All of the work that we've done out there, Steve and I pretty much did just on our own without any funding, at least since 2008. And I'd have to say that more than half of the data that we've amassed was brought together during that period, during the free period. Now, what we did was all the metal detecting we could muster whenever we had an opportunity in an area that was mowed or clear cut or burned, we metal detected. And that's a process that's gone on now since, let's see, from 2002 until the present. We're still doing this. We're still covering parts of the battlefield. Now, for my part, this really accelerated in 2022 when the pandemic came along and I didn't have much else to do at the Institute of Archaeology, which was closed anyway. So I spent probably half of my time on the Camden battlefield and added a huge amount of data to our distribution. And also found a total of 3 burials, which I'll get to later. Our method all along has been to do relatively small pieces of the battlefield, small delineated pieces, which are covered at least 100%, sometimes 200% in perpendicular coverage. And each artifact, each battle artifact, is mapped with a survey grade GPS unit. So all the data you're about to see is a GPS point that is accurate within a meter and usually a lot tighter than a meter. And that's what's going on here, is people using a GPS unit to record with. The larger photograph in the background, if you look carefully, there's about a dozen orange flags. They're difficult to see, but each one of those is a battle artifact in that little clearing. This is our data as of last September. We now have more than 2,900 battle artifacts mapped. Actually, since then, I can add about another 300 points to that blob on the lower left, the dense area on the lower left, which is really the heart of the battlefield. So what you're looking at is not an extrapolation or model or my projection. What you're looking at is actual empirical evidence of the Battle of Camden. That is the Battle of Camden. And as you can see, we've got enough offshoots of coverage to say that that's it. Now, we can't necessarily interpret the internal events or the chronology within that blob. But if you read the 14 or 15 primary sources and you look at this map, it makes a whole lot of sense. It fits together remarkably well. And again, this is the real thing. It's not a guesstimate on my part. These are actual battle artifacts. And as I say, we've got upwards of 3,000. Eventually, I want to cover a lot more of the green areas that aren't covered at all on this map. And if nothing else, it will accentuate the actual location of the battlefield. So you can see now how I'm able to put the units on that other map, because this tells me where the fighting occurred. Another thing we did back when we had grant money in the early part of the last decade, well, 2 decades ago, I did a collector survey. I tried to find as many private collectors as possible, and I interviewed them and cataloged their collections, photographed their collections, and so forth. I ended up with 13 individuals who were able to give me useful information about the battlefield. And this third kind of information, we have the historical primary sources, we have the archaeological data, and we've got this collector information. And believe it or not, the collector information fit really, really well with the other 2 kinds of information. Those of you who have done a lot of archaeology understand that it's not that often that your documentary evidence and your archaeological evidence and your informant information actually work together. They usually don't make any sense. But in this case, all 3 kinds of information worked really well. And I'm very happy with the result. Another thing we did back when we had money was we tried to verify the locations of several burials expedient battlefield burials that had been reported to me by collectors. We were only able to find 2 of those. I had a total of 8 burials reported to me, and 6 of those we were not able to locate. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that the property had been clear cut after those graves were found by relic hunters. So the visual frame of reference for the locations was gone. This burial on the right here ends up being burial number 1 in the information that I'm about to get to, who is the only British soldier in the project. So this is 2006, as you can see. So we didn't do any other excavation until 2022. Only metal detector. Now, as you can see from the subtitle here, we ended up in 2022 with 14 individuals in 7 different graves. This was not what we expected. As I mentioned, I think we had found 3 additional burials metal detecting. So we had the 2 collector burials that we had verified in 2006, and we had 3 more that we found metal detecting. We met with Doug Bostic with the South Carolina Battleground Preservation Trust, and he agreed to substantially fund an excavation to recover these 5 individuals, and possibly 6. I thought there was a 6th grave that we could relocate. So we budgeted this thing originally for 5 or 6 individuals. We also imagined that the burials were in much better condition than they actually were. So as we'll see, the budget for this thing went right out the window, and I needed rescuing, which I got. Now, I don't normally like to see a lot of text in a PowerPoint slide, but I wanted to emphasize these 3 points, because all along we've had some criticism about even doing this project. Like, why don't you just leave these guys there and forget about it? Well, these are the 3 reasons. These are my 3 reasons for doing this project. 1, the existing graves were very poor. These individuals were buried, most of them within a foot of the modern ground surface. They were impacted in some cases by plowing, by weathering, by relic hunting, and subject to all sorts of degradation in the coming decades. I thought they needed proper military burials, and I wanted to do it on the battlefield. And that's my second point. I envisioned being able to walk across the Camden battlefield 5 years from now and see a scatter of grave markers of individuals who were actually killed in action. I thought that would really mean something to people visiting the battlefield. And as we'll see, that didn't work out. Research interest, of course, the primary archaeological research interest. We were interested in the physical anthropology of these guys and whatever trauma brought about their demise, and their weapons, their equipment, and even the burial practice itself. So I'll go through these burials real quickly. As I say, we had 7 different graves, but we had a total of 14 individuals. Now, this is the previously confirmed British burial. This was an enlisted soldier from the 71st Regiment of Foot, Fraser's Highlanders, a regular British soldier. And he's the only individual who is decently buried. He was fairly deep, as you can probably see the ground surface in the upper left corner there. So he's actually 2.5 feet in the ground. And by the standards of the remainder of these burials, that was quite deep. You can also see that he was laid out properly. Not very well preserved. We were real surprised about that because the previous testing had suggested that they would be fairly well preserved. He's not well preserved at all. And in fact, his skull was almost completely annihilated by a pine taproot. So we lost that as well. This is burial number 4, which is as I said, I had 8 burials reported to me by collectors. They were numbered 1 through 8. The next one we actually relocated was number 4. This individual is not really identified by what sort of unit he belonged to. The only thing that was found on him by the collectors who found him 30-odd years ago were civilian coat buttons. So he's probably a militiaman rather than a regular soldier. He had no military material anywhere on the burial, according to the individuals who found it. Now, the big surprise here was this individual ended up being a Native American. As soon as he reached the coroner's lab and Bill Stevens, project member Bill Stevens, who was a deputy coroner in Richland County and an archaeologist, as soon as Bill began to look at the skull of this individual, he could see that the individual was clearly a Native American. Now, from his placement on the battlefield, that suggests that he was probably a loyalist North Carolina militiaman. It's possible that he was a Maryland Continental soldier who was not wearing a regimental coat. It may be that they were in such poor supply that he did not have a uniform coat. But given the placement on the battlefield, I think he's probably a loyalist militiaman from North Carolina. This is where they were on the battlefield. In addition to that detail, there were 2 American burials very close to this burial, 2 continental burials. And it would have been just as easy to throw this guy in with those continentals, if indeed they had all been continental soldiers. Burial 9, I found metal detecting in 2020. I thought I had a single individual when I discovered the burial. When we excavated, there were these 5 individuals stacked together. They're all Continental enlisted men. This grave was full of badly corroded USA buttons that were correct for a Continental uniform coat. These individuals also had a total of 3 musket balls, fired musket balls associated with their remains. There's 5 individuals here. The other 2 may have been bayoneted or shot through with a musket ball. There's no telling. The condition of the bone was such that that kind of trauma was not really visible on the bone. Bill Stevens and his colleagues did their best to try to identify that sort of trauma on the bone of all of these individuals, and it just wasn't possible. The bone was too far gone to get that kind of information, like a bayonet stab wound or a bullet impact in the absence of a bullet. And by the way, this is Bill Stevens on the right here and his colleague, Matty Atwell, both from the Richland County Coroner's Office. Burial 10. This was another individual. I believe I found this guy in 2021 with a metal detector reading. Another individual loaded with USA buttons, obviously an enlisted Continental soldier. He was extremely shallow. In this case, the individual was buried in a hole that was probably too short for his body. So his knees were projecting upward. His legs were bent and his knees were projecting upward. This burial was so shallow that had they not eroded away, his knees would have been projecting from the ground now. Not in 1780, but now we would have seen his knees sticking out of the ground. But of course, they had eroded away. We could see on the femurs, where the femurs came up to the modern ground surface, and then you could see a bleached area where each one had been eroded away. So this guy was literally sticking out of the ground when he was buried. There was a musket ball and a buckshot associated in direct association with this individual. So he was shot to death. Now, I should have pointed out, portions of the battlefield have never been plowed. And that's actually kind of extraordinary in the eastern United States. But in the sand hills, there are still substantial tracks that have never been plowed because they were left in turpentine trees. And that's true of about, I'd say 30% of what we now have of the Camden battlefield. We have these tracks that have never been plowed. Now, in the case of Burial 10, had this individual been subject to agricultural plowing, he would have been completely annihilated. We might have found some artifacts, but I don't think we would have had anything like a coherent burial. But this is on a part of the battlefield that was clearly in turpentine trees. This burial was two Continentals located very close to the Native American burial 4. These individuals had USA buttons and one musket ball and one buckshot. You can see one was substantially on top of the other. The individual on the left was actually missing one of his legs entirely. And that's something else I should have mentioned. Several of these individuals were missing entire limbs. And it didn't look like they'd been plowed away or destroyed by the plow. It didn't look like a traumatic amputation like you might get from an artillery round or something, canister. They were simply missing. The entire arm or leg was missing. And this is probably the result of pigs or dogs predating these graves. And frankly, you can go online and see this happening in Ukraine right now. You can see pigs, dogs, cats, and so forth checking out shallow burials. So that's probably what's happened with these guys. When they're missing entire limbs like this, those limbs were probably dragged off by animals. We also had a certain amount of scatter on some of the artifacts from these individuals that was not explained by plowing. And I think that's explained by portions of bodies, possibly in portions of uniforms, being dragged partly out of the graves, partly away from the graves. On this individual, you can see there's a plow zone in this location, and the plow has impacted the cranium of the individual on the right. This individual, Steve Smith, found while we were metal detecting. He had no uniform elements at all. There were no military buttons, no civilian buttons. He was shot with a British musket ball, and the only artifact that was actually on his remains was this Continental bayonet scabbard tip, which is distinct from what a British bayonet scabbard tip looks like. So it's actually a very diagnostic artifact for a Continental enlisted man. So it's not really that much of a jump to say that this individual as well is a Continental soldier. He was also located in the area well to the north of the battlefield where the Continentals were attempting to escape the battlefield. And there was a lot of probably unnecessary homicide as opposed to prisoner of war taking on that part of the battlefield. These three individuals were also fairly close to burial 4, the Native American, 3 more Continentals, 2 more fired musket balls. And you can see that they were fairly shallow. There's some plow damage. There's a little bit of limb predation. And they have the classic posture of that you get from someone who bloats during decomposition. If you look at the photographs from Gettysburg and Antietam of the individuals who have begun to decompose, you see this posture. Why we don't see it on some of the other burials, I don't know, because they weren't deep enough to prevent this. But these individuals have that classic posture. Okay, that's it. A quick run through of the burials. I wanted to add that each time we finished extracting one of these individuals, when they went to the coroner's vehicle to go back to Columbia, we did a brief flag ceremony on the final boxes of remains of the individual that went to the vehicle. And we did this for everybody, and I mean, I don't know what to say about it. It just seemed like something that we should do. And there are some examples. Artifacts. We did not have a lot of artifacts. The 71st burial, the one British soldier, had a better assemblage of material than everybody else put together. He was buried in his full uniform. His shoulder sword belt for his claymore sword had been thrown into the grave with him. And that's what this thing on the left is. You can see it's a 71st Regiment device that went on the tip of the belt. He was covered with 3 dozen of these 71 buttons, which is the standard enlisted pattern button for that regiment. The USA buttons that most of the Continentals displayed in quantity were all in completely disastrous condition. You can see even the one on the left that you can still sort of read is about to fall apart. Now I've got, I suppose, 150 of these in my lab, and most of them are just small containers of little gray fragments. I'm going to try to put together a few for illustration purposes for the report, but for the most part, they're completely trashed. And the most important information I was able to get out of them was the fact that they were indeed USA Continental buttons. Here's an example that I've already pieced back together. And this is by far the best one. So that'll tell you something about the condition. On the left is a French gunflint from one of the American burials, an unused gunflint. There was also an unused gunflint in the 71st burial. So a total of 2 gunflints, probably in the pockets of these individuals. The thing on the right is a tin cup, an iron cup, minus its handle, flattened out. This was in the top of burial 13. The triple burial of the individuals who appeared to have undergone decomposition and bloating. I suspect that this cup was used as a digging tool. It's likely that there was not a big supply of shovels to be had on the battlefield on August 16th, so they were probably using all sorts of things to dig these graves. Clearly, they didn't have what they needed, given that the graves are about 1 foot deep, or in one case, 7 inches deep. So this tin cup is very likely there for that reason. And we had a total of 9 impacted musket balls and 2 impacted buckshot among these 14 individuals. Some were in direct association, like the one on the left, where it's actually stuck on a human ulna. The one on the right was in the abdomen of another individual in soft tissue. So we can't demonstrate that it's actually there for that reason, but it's pretty obvious. So at least 9 of these individuals were probably shot to death or wounded badly enough that they could be bayoneted or clubbed to death. The others may have been killed in hand-to-hand action, or they may have been shot through and through by a musket ball. Before I get to the postscript, which I just added last night, by the way, I think I mentioned that we badly misjudged this project. I was primarily responsible for badly misjudging it because I thought I had 5 or 6 burials in good condition. I had 14 burials in very poor condition. Happily, for reasons that are not clear to me, I have friends in the archaeological community, including some great people at several agencies. I was able to get a crew of 3 experienced people from DNR, from the Heritage Trust Program, their archaeology office, and a backhoe, a free backhoe. From the Richland County Coroner's Office, I had Bill Stevens and Matty Atwell, and usually a couple of other people when they came out. And they were there probably half the time. And these are people, of course, with full-time jobs. From the TRC archaeological contracting firm, a couple of good friends of mine, including Mona, who will hate that I'm pointing her out in the middle of the crowd. Mona Grundon should stand and wave or something. Anyway, I had a whole collection of people who just came out and helped us out with this. Historic Camden provided personnel and all sorts of support. And of course, they're currently the managers of the site. They own most of it, and they're currently managing it. So their staff helped us out immeasurably. And a lot of just individuals came out and helped out with this. So the day was saved. The 14 individuals were excavated. We went well beyond Doug Bostick's South Carolina Battleground Trust budget and continue to go beyond it. But it worked out okay. And we ended up with a pretty good project. Now, Doug Bostick's part in this, some of it had to do with the approaching 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. And his interest, of course, is in battlefield preservation. So he's looking at publicity and fundraising for preservation, for battlefield preservation, not just at Camden, but throughout the state. And so Doug funded the project partly for that reason, so that we would have, or he would have, this fairly spectacular result to celebrate and commemorate. And Doug put together this amazing 3-day event that ran from April 20th to the 22nd in Columbia and Camden that ended up being just an amazing thing. Now there's a problem with it that we'll get to very shortly. This is right before the event, where we're over at the coroner's office and we're getting people put in these 18th century coffins. These were made out of old growth pine. I don't think it's heart pine. It's not 18th century pine, but it's from very old and large trees. And so these boxes are just absolutely amazing recreations. They were made with hand wrought nails. And this is how these guys were getting buried. Now, of course, my plan was that everybody would be buried on the battlefield in their original grave locations. Now, that was one of the original points. Well, Doug put together this amazing series of commemorative events for April. And it was advertised as the reburial event, the Camden reburial commemoration. One of the things Doug did was he approached the Army about getting the Old Guard ceremonial unit from Arlington to come down and participate in this. And so that was more or less scheduled throughout the spring, but he put together all sorts of other plans. In March, I believe, I began to hear from a federal archaeologist and another individual from Arlington about proving that we had Continental soldiers. The point being that they were not able to expend taxpayers' money to come from Arlington to do this event unless they were dealing with regular U.S. soldiers. So Steve Smith and I went to a great deal of trouble, very redundant trouble, I should point out, because they kept asking me the same questions over and over again. They wanted evidence that I had 12 Continentals out of these 14 people. They even came down and visited finally and looked at my artifacts, and they were convinced, yes, these 12 individuals are Continental soldiers. And I thought that was great because that satisfied the requirement that the Arlington people could only deal with regular U.S. soldiers. So here we are. This is the first day of the event. I think this is April 20th. The dead are lying in state in the Kershaw House in Camden. That night we had this panel. We gave 3 presentations, of which the middle part of this is what I'm doing there on April 22nd. April 20th. This is April 22nd. This is the reburial day. So here we go. We're going to rebury these guys on the battlefield. You can see we've got a caisson with the British individual and an honor guard from the Royal Scottish Regiment that came over for the event. There's some of the crowd at the bottom. And on the lower left, we can see the governor holding forth. On the right, this is right after the event ended, and the coffins are there laid out, quote unquote, for reburial. Now, what was actually happening was about 4 days before the event, the Army got in touch and said, you can't rebury these guys because they are regular U.S. soldiers. And they are under our jurisdiction. So you can't do what you're planning to do. Now, of course, Doug had this incredible event planned. You know, this thing was already happening within about 4 days. So he went ahead with the event. He made a little bit of an announcement and said, okay, we're not actually going to rebury, but it didn't really get around that much. Most of the people at the event thought that we were literally reburying these guys that evening, which was the original plan. And of course, it didn't happen. Now, originally, the Army was supposedly willing to let us create a cemetery on the battlefield. That was the original compromise, for whatever it's worth. And that would have been okay with me if we had everybody in a dedicated battlefield cemetery that was exclusive to individuals who died in the Battle of Camden. That would have been fine. We could have had all 14 individuals there, and we could have added to it with additional archaeology. And for a month or so, it appeared that was the compromise. And we were actually looking for a location on the battlefield where we could put that cemetery without actually impacting the battlefield. And we planned to survey the site and, you know, get ready to create that cemetery. Well, then I guess it was in late May, early June, the Army came back and said, no, no cemetery on the battlefield either. And their plan was to bury everybody at Fort Jackson in the brand new cemetery at Fort Jackson, along with, of course, 21st century military burials. Nobody liked that plan very much. So there was ultimately a second compromise, which I didn't have anything to do with. I had nothing to do with any of this discussion for some reason. The old Quaker cemetery, which includes the old Presbyterian cemetery in Camden, the historic cemetery, which is indeed a pretty impressive historic cemetery. For some reason, the Army decided that it would be okay to put these guys there. Now, why they could go to the old Quaker cemetery and not the Camden battlefield, I don't know, because obviously the old Quaker cemetery is not a VA cemetery. But in any case, that's what happened. And the whole thing was not very well publicized. It didn't hit the press until immediately after the individuals were buried. So there was no outpouring of public anger or bad press or anything else. And indeed, on the 13th of August, the Army buried these guys in the old Quaker cemetery. They were buried completely without ceremony. I think the Army reasoned that they had already spent $1 million on the old guard on April 22nd. So they didn't need to have any kind of ceremony on August 13th. So there were a bunch of laborers from the funeral home where these guys have been stored, and a couple of Army officers and a couple of Army civilians, and it was a purely functional burial. They were simply getting these guys in the ground and covering them up. And a couple of days later, they put up the generic Army marker, which I'm not real fond of either. We had designed markers for these individuals when we were planning to put them on the battlefield. But anyway, that's what's happened. And if I'm closely questioned, I will confess that I am not happy about this at all. As far as I'm concerned, it just about wrecked the project at the tail end. But here they are, and there they will rest. By the way, I'm not sure what the Rev War is. Notice they apparently the United States can't afford to put a period after the V. Much less can they afford to spell out revolutionary. So these guys are dead from the Rev War. Anyway, I won't harp on that any further. And indeed, my time is such that I need to entertain questions.